Well, Peter is reminding us now, when it comes to not paying evil with evil and not paying insult with insult, he definitely says now you need to, on the contrary, you need to repay with blessing. You repay evil with blessing. So I'm going to say this again. I had the privilege to be at a funeral service recently, and as you know, many of you have been in funeral services. But when it comes to funeral services, is the understanding that when somebody gets up there in the service and speaks or gives a beautiful narrative of the person that recently died. It is a celebration, the remembrance, the objectivity of bring experiences, stories, narratives, experiences, personal, communal of the individual. So when the Bible says, when Peter says, I want you to repay evil with blessing, I want you to speak. I want you to choose. Remember, emotions, compassion. I want you to choose to speak. I want you to choose, for you to choose, because it's pretty obvious. The individual that has died was not perfect. Whoever he was, whoever she was not perfect. We choose to speak positively towards that individual. So can you imagine a generation of men and women that in the context of brokenness, of trial and difficulties, we make the choice not only to avoid repaying evil with evil, and insult with insult. But what if we were the generation that instead we literally speak, that instead of waiting until the individual dies, what if I were to bless those who curse me? What if I were to bless those who persecute me? What if I were to love my enemies? That's exactly what he's describing in the context of persecution, in the context of bullying, in the context of abuse. Well, Peter finally says, and this is how he closes this, because you were called. Because you were called, and you were called to inherit. The Bible says you were called to inherit a blessing. So again, I just want to remind you that the call that you have, I'm just translating over this weekend, this last week and this weekend. We have been traveling. We're out of town because we're taking our son, our youngest, into college orientation. And when I think of my kids going to school, graduating, pursuing higher education, college, whatever they're doing, I'm thinking of how they were designed, created by the Lord, how they were educated by us as parents, but eventually is reflected on their inclination, their preferences when it comes to vocation. If you think of a doctor, you can think of a nurse, you think of an engineer, you think of a teacher, you think of a stay-home mom, whatever, the vocation, the inclination. When Peter speaks of how you, the you is plural, you were called, so the calling is for all of us, right? All of us that we have made the choice not to repay evil with evil because of a forensic agent that gave us a mercy when we deserve evil, when we deserve the curse, when we deserve punishment. He gave us mercy. I'm talking about Jesus, the forensic agent. When we make those choices, the Bible says that he gave us what he gave us, salvation, because that's a calling, that's a vocation. Just like a person choosing a career, choosing a specific path to exercise. Hear me say this: the vocation that we're describing is the vocation that Jesus had. I'm going to say that again. The vocation that we are called, when Peter says you were called, is exactly the same calling. What was Jesus' calling? Well, the calling of Jesus was exactly suffering. See, suffering was never accidental, was never circumstantial. Suffering was simply the result of a bullying situation. Please look at me for a second. This is the time, this is the moment when we speak with passion and we affirm the trustworthiness of the Bible. Because people, you and I, were constantly bombarded. We are ourselves asking the question, what is going on? How long is this going to go on? How can we deal with this scenario, this situation? I'm telling you, if we were to embrace the indicative, and that indicative, what Jesus has done, and put it and embrace it and receive it in salvation, we will understand that the future of our lives, the reason why we are still here and where this is moving, is literally understanding that we are not exempt from trials. We are not exempt from tribulation. One day we will be the ones laying on a casket, because death is unavoidable. Every single one of us eventually will physically die. Look at me for a second. What we're describing on this calling is to understand that where there is suffering, where there is divisiveness, where there is racial tension, where there is economic difficulties, where there is illness, physical illness, or eventually death, none of those things define who we are. This is the understanding that our calling, the reason why we go through the things that we're going through is because God has the ability, not necessarily to make us immune from the suffering, from the difficulties, but my calling is literally to take the brokenness of the world and literally use it as the stage for our character, for our worldview to be shaped into the image of Jesus. All that I'm saying is that difficulties, trials, COVID-19 makes no difference between Christians and Christians. The difference is simply the calling. And tragically, many people, including Christians, we have made the mistake because of twisted theology, because not understanding the gospel, is that we failed, or we preach a gospel that says if you come to Jesus, you will avoid all this craziness. That's not the gospel. The gospel said that you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. Hear me say this for a quick second. When it comes to the blessing, I'm going to say that again. The blessing is not the absence of struggles. The blessing is not the absence of death. The blessing is that at the end of the journey, at the end of exercising with faithfulness and courage and determination and togetherness and unity and compassion and love for one another, at the end of that journey, what you get is the blessing. And that blessing is God. What you get at the end is God. What you get at the end is not simply the absence of hell and damnation, although it's included. At the end, what you get is not simply this place called paradise or heaven, although it's included. What you get at the end is God.